if your foundation is really in what is generally a modern philosophy, it's not going to support the house of your Catholic theology.
Many skeptics would say it came from nothing. Is that possible?
Sure, and then you have to yeah, that is the quintessential amazing question. Because then you have to ask the question, well, what the heck is nothing? If you literally don't know what undergirds existence and you don't have any theories about it, and you're trying to live legitimately agnostically, you're ultimately just going to say nothing matters, I think. Is this making sense, Alexis?
Yeah, no, it
I'm
makes
kind of
sense.
it's a lot of stuff.
I feel like every question, you can't just answer it with a simple
You can't.
one
No, you
sentence
cannot.
thing.
It's absolutely incredible. And so what that means for us right here and now is that our suffering has infinite value.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me and Parker again. Let's welcome Parker again for
Yeah,
our
thank you.
second discussion. If you guys don't already know, Parker hosts Catholicism in the Car, and he's here with me today to talk about philosophy. And it's a really big subject.
Yeah, probably the biggest subject. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's a reason why every PhD is a doctorate in philosophy, right?
that's true.
So,
All right. So we're just going to dive right in. Why is it so important that we learn philosophy? What
yeah,
purpose does it
so
serve?
oh my goodness. So it 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 serves so many purposes. It's almost hard to really identify them all. But I think first and foremost, um, the idea of metaphysics in philosophy, which is really the core, and I'll define that here in a second. Um, Basically, what it is, metaphysics is looking um, at reality and asking, like, what is it? What is reality? What undergirds the physical world? What makes it what it is? And in Aristotle's works, the reason that he has a certain work in his collected works called Metaphysics, and it was actually named posthumously by people after Aristotle. But the reason they named it that was because it came after his book on the physics. But it seeks to show, after you've really based yourself in the physical world very, very well. Then you start to ask questions. Okay, now what's underneath all this? What supports all this the universe around us, the matter around us? And it's those types of questions that really lead to not just the whats of the physical world, but the whys. Okay, the question why. Um, the the deeper question that empirical science can't really get to. It has limits, and that's where philosophy kind of takes over,
Well, science
particularly as
can't really
regards.
answer, science doesn't answer what or why or who, sorry. It
Right.
doesn't answer, it cannot answer who or why. It can answer what or
Yes.
how, but it can't answer
Right.
those other two questions. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. I think, yeah, that's a really, really good kind of distinction there. I like
Yeah.
that. But
Thanks.
yeah, so why is philosophy important? I, I think it really comes down to just simply that. Do you wish to think about things greater than the physical world around you, or underneath the physical world around you, however you want to look at it? And I think ultimately we come to those questions if we're deep thinkers. If you see a light switch on the wall and you notice that it turns on and off and it turns the light on and off, then you ask yourself, well, how the heck does that work? And now you're doing physics, right? And you get into all of the equations for how light works and the electricity and the ohms and all that, and it's very complex. I'm not an expert in that, but um, uh, but eventually, the beautiful thing actually about electricity is eventually it kind of comes down to the weird world of quantum physics that we really don't understand a whole ton yet. Um, and that's kind of where our understanding breaks down at that point. And then we start having to ask the questions uh, of who and how, or who and why, right? Um, why is it that that light is both a particle and a wave, right? That's a very interesting question that we really have no idea the answer why there. Like you can ask why does the ball roll down the hill? Well, because I pushed it, right? But then you ask, well, how did I get the ability to push it? Um, where did I come from? Why do I exist, right? How did how did the people that put me in motion come into exist, right? And then you can go back
Yeah,
and farther
it's like a
until you get to the
snowball.
beginning. Yeah, the snowball kind
Yeah.
of thing, until you get to the as far as you can n- know about it, about the subject, and then you're kind of left with going past the empirical, right? If you want to continue asking those questions, particularly the question of why. Um, so I think it really comes down to that. Are you the kind of person, and you should be the kind of person that desires to know the whys of everything in life? I mean, you don't necessarily, if you don't really care about the why of electricity and you just like that it works, I mean, that's all right. But there are deeper questions like, why do I exist, right? Why do the things around me exist? That is the fundamental question, one of the most fundamental questions of philosophy, and it's a subset of metaphysics called ontology, um, basically coming from the Greek word for being, there, and it's asking the question of why does something exist a little more precisely. Um, so I think that realm of philosophy is probably the most important, and it's also the most fun fun
Yeah,
realm,
yeah,
I
it
think.
is.
And it's usually those first questions that people will ask is those whys of existence, and whether it's existence outside of themselves or existence as applied to themselves.
And
um,
how does this help us as Catholics? Why, as
yeah.
Catholics, should we also
Oh
ask this?
man.
Because, most of us just think like, well, I exist because God exists, but
Right. Well,
why?
first off,
How
there's
can it help
uh,
us?
I think there's, especially in our modern context where Christianity is waning, right? There's first of all an apologetics application to this, right? If somebody who's non-Catholic, non-Christian, non-theist comes up to you and asks you questions about, why the heck do you believe what you believe? Ultimately, you're going to get down to questions of philosophy, especially if you're talking with an atheist, or a non-Christian. um, you're gonna end up needing to employ questions of philosophy so that you're on the same base level, right? As close as possible, so you can talk about the same sorts of things. Because if I'm talking to an atheist and I start bringing up, uh, you know, that God created the world and all that, well, that doesn't really affect him because he doesn't believe in God. So we have to go deeper there. We have to go into questions of philosophy, not questions of theology. And I think people it can be helpful to understand that when particularly when priests are formed in the seminaries, they need at least 2 years, or a bachelor's degree in philosophy before they can enter upon studies in theology, and it's been that way for the I mean, it's been particularly set up that way for about the past 150 years, but before then, even Thomas Aquinas talks about it, that you need a very, very good education in philosophy before you engage in theology. um, and part of that is because all of the theological truths that we believe, they're really rooted and grounded in philosophical truth. It's like you're building a house, and um, you lay the groundwork, and then your foundation is like that philosophy. um, a good understanding of the physical world, right, um, is necessary, but then also a good understanding of how we understand what undergirds the physical world and how we express that, um, is incredibly helpful for theology, because once you get into theology, the deep questions of theology are questions like, um, you know, those that were answered at the first few councils of the church, the Council of Nicaea, Council of Constantinople, and all them, where, um, we're asking questions about God's nature, and how is it that Jesus is both God and man? Those are those are questions where you need a good foundation of philosophy in order to understand them, and you need a good foundation in a particular form of philosophy in order to understand them. Because there are various different philosophical paradigms that uh, are floating around and have floated around throughout human history, just like any science, any institutional set of knowledge. We end up disagreeing on a bunch of different things, and so you do need a specific type of philosophy to help undergird your Catholic philosophy. If you are if your foundation is really in what is generally a modern philosophy, and we can get into that in a second on what exactly that means, but it's not going to support the house of your Catholic theology. There's going to be a ton of inconsistencies within yourself. You're gonna have confusions between what you believe about the world around you, aka philosophy, and what you believe about God, His relationship with you and other people, aka theology. Um, there's going to be like a disconnect. It's not gonna
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not gonna make a whole lot of sense.
It's
So
true what you say about modern philosophy, because here in France, they actually, unlike in Canada, we don't actually have any formation at school, at public school, at least. But here in France, you
in
take,
philosophy, you mean?
yeah, there's
Okay,
no
yeah.
formation at all in philosophy. But here
There's not in America either, but
in France, you do at 14. It's part of the curriculum, but it's
really,
modern philosophy. They
okay,
don't teach anything like what we're probably going to talk about.
yeah,
It's geared
yeah,
towards, basically you end up an atheist by the end of your philosophy class, or you're introduced to very atheistic ways of thinking and nothing else, and everything
okay,
that religious Catholic philosophers, theologians are just pushed aside as religious zealots, and it doesn't make any sense at all. So yeah, I agree. I know exactly
yeah,
what you mean. Uh, so we're going to talk about three questions. We're going to take up three of the most important questions that people ask today, and I'll try and play devil's advocate whenever you bring up
sure,
a point, just to help everybody out there who might ask those questions as well. Um,
sure.
so we're going to talk about three metaphysical questions, because I feel like that's the thing that people have the most difficulty with. But it's the thing; these are the questions that people ask most frequently. Uh,
Right.
so first of all, Parker, does God exist? How do we know?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways you can approach the question. Um, but here's the one that I like. I think you first have to ask the question, does the physical world around you exist? Um, because believe it or not, there are people who will deny that claim. They'll say it's just a product of the mind. And that's honestly a very large tenet of modern philosophy, believes that ultimately. They may not come right out and say it, but they do ultimately believe that um, that the world around us is really just a product of the mind, or at least um, what is visible about the world around us is a product of the mind. Okay, maybe the dirt isn't a product of the mind, um, but anything that we place value upon would be. Okay, um, when you start talking about values and ethics and morals and things of that nature, you start doing you start getting past the empirical world, and you start asking deeper questions. And what happens is a lot of modern philosophy is rooted in thought that all that just comes from the mind. It's really not really either it's not real, okay, or they say it's devalued because it comes from the mind. Okay, so um, so I would start there when we're asking the question of does God exist? you first want to ask the question, does the physical world exist? And what exactly do you understand by the physical world? Do you mean that it's something that you can actually interact with and it's a meaningful interaction? Or is the physical world something that you can never really truly interact with, because there is no meaning? And that ultimately gets to a deeper question of like, what is meaning? What is value in the world? Okay, and those are slightly separate questions, but they are very much related to the question of God. Um, and so again, there's a very various different avenues you can take to get back to God. And but starting with the physical world, I think the best argument is the argument from motion. I really enjoy that argument, especially for the modern world.
Could you explain
Um,
what that is, the argument of motion,
yeah,
for everybody?
yeah. So I push a ball down a hill, right? We ask the question, well, why is the ball moving? Well, because I pushed it. That's kind of obvious. But then we ask the question, well, how did I get in motion in order to push that ball, right? Um, how was I put in motion? Well, we think about first initially it would be through my parents, okay, right? And from a natural point of view, that's very true. My parents put me in motion. Well, who put them in motion? Well, their parents. Who put them in motion? Their parents. And you can go all the way back, all the way throughout human history, and you get to the either the first two human beings, however you want to look at it. It seems uh, mathematically probable, possible at least, that there would be two human beings, right? But it doesn't necessarily need to be that case from a natural perspective. There could have been multiple sources. So you ask, well, how did those multiple sources come about, for the human race and the first human beings? And then you just continue down the line looking at those species, okay, right? Until you get as far back as you possibly can, and maybe that's a bunch of amino acids sitting in a pool somewhere, and they're doing whatever it is. But where did those come from? Well, they came from minerals in the ground, and this is the whole
Yeah.
evolution story, all the way back.
Yep.
Whether it's true or not, however empirically um, valuable it is or not, and epistemologically valuable. So epistemology is the philosophy of understanding, okay, how we understand things. And you know is how valuable is that theory if we weren't there, right? Are we really looking at the physical world around us, or are we looking mostly in the mind at that point, in our own constructs that we've made? So anyway, the we go all the way to the beginning to just where we have dirt. Okay, let's say, well, where did the dirt come from? Where did the rock come from? The asteroids, the barren world, Earth, the planets, the stars. Where did they all come from? And you can just keep asking till you get back to the beginning, and then you have you ultimately get to the question of, well, where did the first thing in existence come from, whatever that might be? All right, where did the first thing begin to exist, or first multiple things? And you notice a pattern here that everything has a cause. Everything has a beginning and it has an end in some way, um, and so they have causes. And so you get back and back and back, and then you start asking, well, where did the whole physical world come from? Now you have kind of two answers here. Either it came from something non-physical outside of the world of matter, outside of the universe, whatever that is. We can talk about that in a bit, but and then the other answer is, well, maybe all of the universe is eternal. Okay, it
Which
just never
it
has a
isn't.
beginning and an end. Yeah, which is, as far as we know by science,
Yeah, at least
by
science has already said there is
yeah,
a beginning.
it seems pretty clear that from the empirical data that the world is not eternal. The stuff around us hasn't always existed, right? Um, Now, what's interesting is historically, the atheists in the ancient world mostly took that second view of saying that the world was eternal and therefore there was no need for a god, right? And that view um, is actually rearing its head in some interesting ways in the modern world. But since then, most people have have taken the view that there had to have been some sort of that the universe is linear in its time. It's not circular. Okay. It's not eternal. It's not that it basically it has a beginning, and it will probably have an end.
And so to the
And that is
skeptic
the
that
current scientific narrative.
and so this to the skeptic that agrees with you, yes, there is a beginning. Well,
Yeah,
that it it came from many skeptics would say it came from nothing. Is that possible?
sure. And then you have to yeah, that is the quintessential amazing question. Because then you have to ask the question, well, what the heck is nothing?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? Because if you mean by nothing, if you mean like a vacuum, like a scientific vacuum where we've sucked everything out that we know of out of it, out of this space, there's still something there. It exists in front of me. I can identify what the heck it is. That is something.
Yeah, but that's
Um,
still
and
something.
so then you have to, yeah, and so then you still have to ask the question, well, where
What do
did
you
that
mean?
come from?
Yeah.
It's still something. Okay, so I remember in high school I had this debate with a kid, and I was like, dude, nothing is nothing. It can't exist.
It is
It's a
nothing.
you can't even think about it, and so
No.
therefore it cannot be the cause of anything. All right. Now we've noticed recently. I think the multiverse theory is they say, well, this universe it came was started from another universe and another universe, and ultimately there you basically get back to either you're just kicking the ball further down the court and you have to ask the question later, or you get to the question. Basically they're believing in an eternal universe again. Okay, that there's just an eternity of multiverses forever and ever and ever. But then you have to ask the question, well, that seems to kind of approximate God. If you're talking about, like,
Yeah.
particularly, I mean, even if it's just one universe and it's eternal,
It's still
that still, like, approximates God, really
exactly.
what we believe God is. So, I mean, my goodness, what's ultimately, I think the death nail for particularly the atheistic point of view, not necessarily the agnostic point of view, but the atheistic point of view is the question of nothing. If your view is um, that everything that exists came from nothing, well, and you mean by nothing actually nothing, then it's incoherent. It's
I think
it's it's
most
incredibly incoherent.
I think most atheists would not ever admit that when they mean nothing, they actually mean absolutely nothing. Most of them
No,
say
they
it's
wouldn't.
actually impossible because reason says you can't have something from nothing. It's just not possible. So it's
Right,
just something
right,
I
right,
feel
right.
like it's more of a thing that they just don't want to admit. They
And I think
agree
that's
on.
and that's where most atheists, I find, end up being like closet agnostics in the end.
Yeah,
And they just end up
definitely.
throwing up their hands and saying, "I don't know," which honestly is agnosticism, from philosophically speaking, is kind of honorable. Um, but at the same time, it it doesn't help anything. Like,
Mhm.
you're admitting your own limits, right, with agnosticism. But what does it actually do for you? Um, if this whole endeavor of philosophy and asking all these questions about how far back can we go and what's at the beginning, or what does beginning even mean, um, if it ultimately leads you to the question, I don't know, how does that bounce back and reflect upon the rest of your existence? Like, if you literally don't know, um, what undergirds existence, and you don't have any theories about it, and you're trying to live legitimately agnostically, you're ultimately just going to say nothing matters, I think.
Yeah, I think
If you're
that's where it ends
really
up.
really if you're really really uh, united to that belief, if you're really dug in on that belief, you're ultimately going to say nothing matters. And most people can't do that, or won't
No.
do that, right? And I think really most all of us can't do that. It's just it's not within human nature to 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 just be okay with not knowing ultimate questions like that. Like, I can be fine with not knowing the intricacies of how electricity works, okay? But I can't be fine with not knowing that everything around me has an actual is actually grounded in something real. Because if I come to that agnostic position and I am, um, and I think if I'm logically honest about it, then nothing around me matters, and why does existence matter in the first place? And then you come to a set of different questions that I think can still lead you to God through a different path besides the empirical one of the ball rolling down the hill. You
Yes,
then get to
definitely.
the other side of these questions of like, what is meaning,
Mm.
and uh, and does meaning mean anything?
Yeah.
Does it is it valuable in some way? And what does all that mean? And I think that takes a lot of self reflection. That's a much more personal journey that someone can make, and I think ultimately it will lead someone to some sort of um, spirituality in some way, um, some sort of paradigm that that believes in non-physical realities in some way. Okay, because by the very if you answer the question, what is meaning, you've already admitted that something non-physical can exist, and that is the reality
Yeah,
of meaning. Okay.
definitely.
um
Yeah.
so and I want to be fair here. Like if I was talking to an agnostic, they'd probably give me a lot of pushback, and I love those conversations, and it is hard to mimic that in a Christian
Yeah.
setting.
Yeah.
We can play devil's advocate, but ultimately, like, we're not
Because I
thinking in
know
the
and
same
you know.
paradigms.
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
Exactly.
and for the purposes of this interview, it probably wouldn't be terribly helpful,
No.
um but I think it is good to play devil's advocate with each other and with ourselves, right? We want to make sure that our faith, um, or our worldview, whatever it is rooted in reality as best as we can know that. Okay, and I think that is particularly going back to the initial question where philosophy comes in, really to be really helpful to the Catholic, to the Christian, to the person in general. This is why I think we should not be just focused upon the needs of the world around us and the people around us, and just focused on that, right? Our own personal needs, just on the physical level, right? We have to ask deeper questions past the physics, which are the
Yeah,
metaphysical.
definitely. Yeah. Right. I think that's good for the first one. Shall we
Yeah, it's kind of
continue?
a
No, I really
fire
like
hose, but
it's
um,
the argument of motion is one of my favorites too. I like the one where for me it's more like a train. So you have a
mm,
cart and a cart and a cart all moving, but there is that initial locomotive that moves by itself that's there
yeah,
before the carts. That's visually helpful to me.
yes.
So next question. Do universals exist?
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. So this, as I mentioned earlier, this question, it gets to the idea of like what is proper philosophy that undergirds Catholicism, your Catholic theology, and what is improper philosophy that will create a lot of discontinuity with your Catholic faith. And really, what it comes down to is this distinction these between two philosophical paradigms, one called realism and one called nominalism. So what do those things mean? Let's break down the words. Realism. It means we're talking about something is real. Now, what's the object of that reality? What are we talking about that is real? Um, and in philosophy, as your question implies, it's a topic, it's a concept called universals, which are, I think, one of the best examples of this, and they do this often in introductory philosophy classes, is they'll ask, um, "What is a chair?" Right? You imagine a wooden chair sitting there in front of you, and so it's a bunch of wood put together, right? In various form. Sorry, my son is at the
It's
door.
okay.
Um, uh, it's a bunch of wood, crafted in a certain form. So you have this matter, and it's in a certain form, And we call that matter, when it's in that form, we call it a chair. Okay. Um, that sentence I said right there is actually girded in nominalism. So this will help. This will help give the dichotomy here. Um, the key word in what I said was we call that a chair. Okay, and the word nominalism, when you break it down, it means nominal, name, what we call something, what we name something. Okay, so we call it a chair. That's why it's a chair. So that's a nominalistic tenet. That's a nominalistic belief. Is that what the chair is, um, outside of just its matter, the form of it, what makes it a chair, is just that we call it a chair. Okay, so that's nominalism. What is realism? Circling back, realism is saying, well, we do call it a chair, but we call it a chair for a reason, and that's because it is.
Yeah.
It is a chair, and there's such a thing as chairness in some way
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
makes it a chair. It's not just in our mind, but it's out there in reality. And this is the key difference between, I think, realism and nominalism. Realism seeks to look outside of us for those answers of universals of what exactly is um, undergirds that matter, what gives it its form. Okay, and nominalism seeks to just say, well, all that gives it its form is the mind. It's all within the mind. And nominalism, if you trace it back, is really, it's the root of all modern philosophy. And it's been around, ever since philosophy's been around. The ancient philosopher Chrysippus was, I think, the first documented person to kind of bring up this theory. I believe he was in the 100s BC, I think it was. Um, so this isn't like a new thing, but it really started to gain traction, and its links to modern philosophy start with William of Ockham in the 15th century, who was a Franciscan priest. He was a Catholic, as most people were in Europe at that time, and and he basically came to the conclusion that, well, okay, let's see here. How do I explain this in the best way? Let's I'll give you a bit of a historical narrative so that you can kind of see what happens, the progression of this thought. And we'll start with Aristotle, our friend Aristotle. So 300s BC, um, Aristotle's on the scene, and he really focuses on the physical world. Okay, he really focuses on the physical world and the importance of the physical world, finding meaning there, and then what undergirds the physical world. So he starts with what's outside of us, and he actually really creates a lot of what Christians will later take up in their philosophy. And he says the chair, it has chairness, that's its form, but it also has matter. And the form is not just something floating out there. Okay, Aristotle says it's not just something floating out there. Okay, um, the chairness doesn't exist if the chair doesn't exist. Okay, so once the matter is obliterated, or even just taken out of its form, if you deconstruct a chair and now it's just a bunch of wood, it's no longer a chair. The chairness of that chair is gone. Now that doesn't mean that chair, the chairness of the chair, was just in our mind. That's not what it means. Aristotle says. He says, um, all that means is that the chairness is the form of the chair is inherent in the matter. The chairness is inherent in the matter. So we can look back at this and we can look at ourselves. We can say, okay, so how would Aristotle view humanity, human nature? And he would say that humans have matter, that's our bodies, but we have our form, which is what we call our soul. Okay, now the soul is not something floating up there. It's not just something that exists, independent of the body. Um, uh, that could never happen. Uh, so basically, when we die, when our matter is decomposed, we cease existing. Okay, we cease existing, and interestingly enough, that philosophy is what undergirds Catholic theology on the matter. which is interesting that because we do believe that um, that the soul after we die is somewhere out there, right? In a weird sort of way. It's in a weird state in heaven, and it's a union with God, but our soul is separate from our body. But the thing is that from Catholic theology, it was not meant to be that way. It was not meant to be that way, that our soul was supposed to be separated from our body. You know, what is death? It's when the soul separates from the body. Um, because of that, particularly because of that decomposition, um, that something terribly wrong has gone physically. Um, so like you break the chair, and now the chair no longer exists. But what we believe is that the soul kind of goes up there, but it wasn't. That whole breaking of the human being was never supposed to happen in the first place. And so God is kind of like he's making a judo move and saying, well, okay, I value these human beings so much, that I will therefore allow their form, their soul to exist without the body for a time. But it's not meant to be like that forever. And it was never meant to be like that in the first place. And so that's why at the end of time, Book of Revelation, all that kind of fun stuff, we're going to be resurrected again. And why the resurrection of Jesus is so important. Okay, so that's connecting some of the philosophy to Aristotle, the Catholic theology to Aristotle. Okay, you get some people like the guy Chrysippus I talked about, and some of the Stoics in ancient Greek philosophy who are kind of more nominalistic in their approach. They disagree with Aristotle on a lot of this stuff. If you look at the chair, they would say, well, the chair is just a product of the mind in some way, and it's a little different than what we kind of call it now. I'm not a huge expert in all of that. In those sort of ancient forms of nominalism. Um, but it really kind of fizzles out by about the third century, um, and and you don't. It's not very prevalent in philosophy in the history of philosophy um, until William Bockham. There's a few other people spaced in there. Peter Abelard, who was in the 11th century, kind of came up with some nominalistic ideas, but he's kind of like the sole guy. Um, Boethius, who was in the 7th century, I think it is. Some people accuse him of nominalism, and I'm not so sure if I agree with that or not. I haven't read enough of Boethius to be able to validate that claim, but I guess the point is from about the 300s until the 1300s, nominalism really isn't a huge deal. And I think that's largely because Christianity was a huge deal in Europe, at least in Western philosophy. So okay, and what does Christianity do? It takes that philosophy of Aristotle in particular, but it also takes a lot of Plato, and the historical things there are very interesting, the history of Christian philosophy. But um, ultimately, it kind of becomes Aristotle kind of wins the day in the 1200s and a few centuries before with Aquinas. Um, Aquinas kind of ends up winning the day, and Scotus. So you have the two mendicant orders in the church. They kind of produce two very influential Aristotelian philosopher theologians. Okay, and because the mendicant orders were so popular and have been so popular since then, that those schools of theology have stayed dominant within the Catholic Church. Um, some people might ask, why didn't I mention Saint Bonaventure for the Franciscans? And that's because mainly he's much more rooted in Augustine, who's rooted in Plato. Okay, but the theology that's ultimately rooted in Plato within Catholicism, um, it doesn't win the day on as many issues throughout Catholic history. The Aristotelian view that 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 when the chair gets destroyed, that the chair is just gone at that point; it's out of existence. That view kind of wins the day, and then they theologize and explain out why it makes sense that the soul would leave the body and be separate from it after death. Okay, like I explained before. Is this making sense, Alexis?
Yeah, yeah, no,
I'm
it
kind of
makes sense.
it's a lot of stuff.
I feel like every question, like for example, like this question, do universals exist? It just you can't just answer it with a simple
You can't.
one
No, you
sentence thing.
cannot.
It really is even the whole does God exist? It's not just one question. You have to answer
No.
so many other questions, and that's what makes it seem daunting to many people is because once you start with one, it just keeps going and
Yep, that
everything is
snowball effect.
connected together. And I it's the same even just with like when I became Catholic, I was so overwhelmed with how much there is to know. I'll never know everything, but
Yeah.
everything, every piece is important. And so that's how it is with especially with metaphysics. You can't just do it in a day. Although I would this is just to introduce everybody to to
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And
I
I hope this isn't too much of a fire hose for people. And I
no,
hope they're able to see the logic. I know I'm going off on a few tangents here and there, but it's
but I
because I'm
think
trying
that's
to
the only
sew everything together.
way. I feel like that's just how it is. I'm currently
Yeah.
I started Monologion. Is that what it's called? By Saint
Yes.
Anselm of Canterbury,
Yes.
and
Yes,
he's
yes, yes.
going through just the existence. And there's like 40, 50 questions, but every question is you just add one on top of the other. And every
Right.
question is like a paragraph long. But when you read it, it's essential everything makes sense. And
Yeah.
he goes through
Yeah.
it every single point and you don't miss anything. But it's just on does God exist? That's all it is. That's the whole thing.
Yes.
Those
Yes,
40, 50
exactly.
questions in there. I
Right.
that's why I so I know what you mean, like, "Oh, is
Oh,
this too much?" No. It's only the beginning, guys. It's just the tip of the
it
iceberg.
really it is. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so this actually transitions really beautifully into the question of William of Ockham and how this was kind of introduced into the modern age. Because William of Ockham, he was a very, very smart man, thoughtful man. Um, and he saw kind of all this complexity that we're talking about. And he said, gosh, this is too hard for people to wrap their minds around. Like this is impractical how complex it is. It needs to be more simple. Um, and basically, you know, if you've ever heard of Occam's razor, I know that gets thrown out a lot, and people don't always know exactly what it means, but it's the basic interpretation is the simplest explanation is the one that should win the day. Okay, and and I think that's true to a certain extent on some things, but really, when you get down to it, there are no simple explanations for any. There aren't
Mm.
any. There's no simple explanation. Yeah. So the doorknob. It's an incredibly complex question that like it's going to get more and more complex the deeper you go in asking the questions why. The only time that it gets simpler is when you reach the limit of what you can know. Okay, and then you just say, well, I can't go any farther right now. Like, um,
At least not
you
at this
know,
moment.
at least at this moment, right? Right. So, you know, like in mathematics, well, I don't want to go into that into calculus, but um, that might just completely lose people. But um, so okay, so William of Ockham, he starts saying like, gosh, there's got to be a simpler way to all this stuff. You know, all the medievals of the High Middle Ages, they were you know people will say they were arguing about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. You know, stupid things like that. And that's kind of what Occam looked at it as he was like, why are we arguing about these stupid metaphysical things like the chairness of a chair that just until you think about it, it seems really stupid. And I'm not saying Occam didn't think about it. He certainly did. He was a very smart guy. But he came to the conclusion that like that we shouldn't be bickering about all this stuff, and it's too complex. And so he wanted to make it a simpler. And I think the problem is that it really can't be made simple. Um, but anyway, what was his proposition? Well, it was that the simpler explanation for why we call that bunch of wood a chair when it's in that form is because it's in our mind. It's literally what we call it. It doesn't have any the chairness doesn't have any existence outside of what we call it. Okay, and then that idea kind of snowballed and basically devolved over the last 800 years, 700 years into kind of modern philosophy. That idea, it became quite popular in the latter Middle Ages. So Occam was in the 1300s, and throughout the 1300s, 1400s, this idea of nominalism um, became fairly popular unto the point where Martin Luther, um, who was an Augustinian monk before he started his reform, right, had basically been trained in the school of William of Ockham, and in the nominalistic school. And up until that point, I don't think people had understood how insidious this philosophy was, or if they did, maybe they thought it would peter out. I don't know all the historical details there, but um, it came unto Luther, and I think really an examination of Luther's writings, and I haven't done a super deep examination of his writings, but will show that a lot of his thought is rooted in that nominalism, and it ultimately there are large strands of Protestantism, not all of them, but large strains of Protestantism that have their roots in nominalism. Now, some have tried to recover themselves from that, and I think that's a good thing. But um, but others have not, and it's a really complex question to start asking. Like, what are all of the instances of nominalism in today's world? Like how exactly could you see them? Like, give me examples of different Protestant groups that hold tenets that are basically nominalistic. Um, I guess for an example, one that I'm thinking of is kind of the idea that the soul is greater than the body. Now, this is something that rears its head throughout Christian history in various ways, um, but it's very prevalent today, um, and it's been prevalent throughout history, especially Christian history, in a number of different sects. But I think it's ultimately rooted in this nominalism, um, because when you when you make the mind the one that discerns the reality, okay, you ultimately put the mind as ahead of the body, um, and and therefore people think mind and soul, they think that they're synonymous, right? And in large part they are, I think. um, so you end up putting the soul, the mind, above the body, and and I think that easily devolves into modern philosophy. And then you see it really rearing its ugly head, and this is why I think this question is so important. This distinction between realism and nominalism is so important, because we're seeing it in our current day in the transgenderism movement, and in a lot of other movements. But I think it's clearest in the transgenderism movement, because what do they say? That basically I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, or vice versa. Um, Basically saying that the self is independent of the body, and therefore we have to make the body conform to what the self is. Okay, we have to make the body conform to what the soul is. And it's like this insidious version of a lot of Catholic spirituality, because a lot of Catholic spirituality will like emphasize the soul over the body. Not that they're doing it with like a ton of metaphysical background, but it's more like a poetic kind of thing. And there's a lot of rabbit holes we can go down with that, but it like flips it on its head, and it says, rather than because in Catholic spirituality, the soul, or what am I trying to say here? The body should conform to the soul, but that's only because basically they say the soul is like God, and we're talking about virtue there. Now, what transgenderism does is it kind of takes that idea and it says, well, virtue doesn't matter. We don't really care about that. What we care about is the identity of the self, and we want the self, we want the body to conform to the self. And so, therefore, if I feel that myself is not what my body shows, therefore I'm going to start lopping off parts of my body in order to make it mesh properly. Okay, um, and that whole idea is ultimately rooted in a nominalistic paradigm of the world. If you trace it back, it's ultimately rooted in that, and I think that that's particularly why this philosophy of nominalism is so insidious, to use the word again. Because it seems kind of innocent at first, like we're just talking about this abstract chair. Why does that even matter? Um, why are we even talking about this? But if you take it to its logical conclusions, it can lead to some very dark places, I
Mhm.
think,
Well, you're just
at least
trying to
from the Christian
conform.
perspective.
You're trying to conform your will to reality versus
Yes,
sorry, the reality to your will
to your
versus the other
will.
way around.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly,
And that's just
exactly.
gonna
And
destroy you.
yeah, and I don't know. Do you know of the Institute of Catholic Culture? Have you
Yeah.
heard of
Yeah, I've
them?
seen that.
Okay,
Yeah.
so they have a really good like philosophy foundation series done by Dr. John Cuddebeck, um, and he really really emphasizes that if if you're trying to learn philosophy to undergird your Catholic faith, the ultimate thing you need to do is look at the physical world first. You need to look at what's outside of you first. You need to do what Aristotle did. You need to learn your physics, learn the world around you, and then start asking the questions of what undergirds it. Because if you don't, if you're not rooted in the reality, that physical reality, um, and in its goodness and its existence, then you'll ultimately just bounce back and you'll say it derives itself from the mind, either
Yeah.
in its entirety or just in its value.
Well, that's
Um,
how it is right now with the world today, right? It's always about
yeah,
the self, what I want, my desires, who I am. And in the end, we don't actually know who we are because we haven't looked outside of
right.
ourselves. And it's always that paradox, right? It's like the more you give, the more you get. Whereas this is I just want to get, and then you get
Yeah,
nothing in return.
right. Because it's
Yeah,
not it's not ultimately there's no foundation on
yeah,
anything at that point. You know, um, a lot of those people don't end up asking the question, "What is the mind?"
yeah,
They don't go deeper. What is the self? Don't need it.
yeah.
Does it even exist?
I
Because
think that
the meaning of things comes from. And what does that even mean?
I think this is good to transition. So, as you said, you were talking about
Mhm.
transgendered people. Um, so, eh, do people have free will? So many people say, "This is how I was born. I was born this way. I was born. Uh, my mind, my soul is that of a woman's,
Mhm.
but I was born in a man's body. But I was born this way." Do those people have free will? Do we all have? Do any of us have free will if we were born the way we're supposed to? If we were created by God, is what many people say. God created me this way, and then you have determinists as well. This is how God wants me to live my life. This is how God intended me to live my life, and therefore I can't go against that. So, do we have free will?
Um, yeah, the question of free will. I mean, I'm going to be honest. It's a really difficult question that Catholics and Christians in general have been wrestling with and struggling with for all of Christian history. Because at least from the theological point of view, you have this dichotomy, paradox even, between God being particularly all-knowing and all-powerful, um, and what that even means for human free will. Okay, so that's looking at it from a theological point of view. Like if God is all powerful and all knowing, like he knows everything that's going on and he can do anything about it, then like is he just controlling all the strings? Um, and how does that balance with the Christian belief in free will? And there are, even just from the Catholic point of view, there are a lot of different avenues you can answer that question from. For those that might be interested to look these things up, there's the difference between like Aquinas's point of view. There's even a Scotistic point of view, a view coming from Blessed John Duns Scotus on it. There's a view from the Jesuits, and Molinism is what it's officially called, Molinism. And I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not super adept at those, in my understanding of those three different views exactly. I can kind of tell you from my own view how I answer the question, and it's largely from the view of Blessed John Duns Scotus. Um, let's see. So I think it comes down to, you asked the question about what is the will, what is free will. Um, and you have to ask the question, what, first off, I think, at least to answer it from a theological point of view, what is the will in God? Um, do we look at the will as this kind of ironclad thing that is just, it's what determines events and morality, and it's like what God says goes, okay? And sometimes the Old Testament can give us that kind of a picture of God. um, eh, but I think another way of looking at God's will, and 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 I think this emphasis is most helpful, is that his will is his font of love. Okay, so God's will is his font of love. It's the source of his love. Um, and what the Franciscan school would do, the school coming from Blessed John Duns Scotus and Saint Bonaventure, what they would say is that the will in God, um, is kind of a greater thing than his intellect, whereas the Dominican school, the school of Saint Thomas Aquinas, would inverse that, and they would say that um, the intellect in God is greater than his will. Okay, and that his will is determined by his intellect. What he does is because of what he knows. Whereas the Franciscans would say, um, what he knows is primarily because of what he loves. Okay, um, and it comes down to that difference between how do we understand the will? Is it primarily, is the emphasis on that it's a source of love out of God and then reflecting that upon the human being, or is it a source of action? Okay, and I think that's a really really good distinction to make, um, for us. And personally, I think that the view um, that God's will is primarily His font of love, um, I think it has the most explanatory power, for this whole question, this whole dichotomy of free will. Um, People would debate with me on that all day long, I'm sure, if they come from different camps. But um, but here's basically what it is. If God's will is primarily his font of love, that means that the will in the human being is primarily the well, it's the primary faculty of the soul, okay, over the intellect even, and it centralizes love and charity, um, in reality. I think it centralizes it in a very beautiful way. And so then you come to the question of free will. I think if you look at it with the lens of love, I think it makes a lot more sense. The lens of love instead of the lens of action or choice. Because most of our modern understanding of free will is based upon an understanding that would say that it's primarily because of action and choice. And there's not really another dimension to it. Okay. They kind of forget about the love dimension if they remember it at all, or if they bring it up at all, they kind of dismiss it. So let's look at it from the human being. If the will is primarily the faculty of the soul through which I love, then that shows us something really beautiful about what free will is. We know that love cannot be forced upon the other. And so I think love can shed light upon what free will is by saying that if love cannot be forced upon the other, then free will, we can't be forced to do something, or else it wouldn't be love. We have to be given that free choice. And so when you look at the relationship between God and the human being, the person might say, well, God is basically forcing you to do something because he knows what you're going to do. He has the entire power the power to stop you. And so therefore that must mean he's basically allowing you to do what you want to do, but then also it kind of breaks down this idea of free will. And if God knows it all and he has the power to do it, then he's just controlling the strings. And
Well,
that's what the modern person would
just
say. But
because just because God knows that it's going to happen doesn't mean that he is making you do it. I I read
yeah, precisely. Yeah.
it was was it C.S. Lewis. This was described it as like an author writing a story. It's not. He even said it's not the most perfect analogy, but as an author creating a story in their mind, they know that this character is going to do this, but that character in the time that it's happening doesn't know that it's going to happen, that what they're going to do. But it doesn't mean that God, he is making you do it. It's just since he is out of time, and I think that kind of helps picturing that God is
Yeah,
not
that
in
is
the
key.
linear time that we
Right.
are living
Right.
in. He is outside as well as inside. It helps. Like, so he sees the map, but you're on the road. You don't know what's
Right.
ahead, but he just sees it.
Yes.
There,
Yes.
he prefers you do this thing, but he sees that you're going to do that thing. That's what it is,
And,
I think.
yeah, and I know that there's a lot of people, and I think I take this view that would say that it's kind of an unintelligible question to ask. You know, does God know what I'm going to do? It
Mm.
actually doesn't even make sense to ask that question
Uh,
if you understand what God is, right?
yeah, exactly. The
Because
nature of God.
unless God is just a guy in the sky, we've anthropomorphized God, then that question makes sense. But if we're truly looking at God, thank you for kind of jogging my mind here and helping me connect the threads. But if we look at God truly in like a classical theist sort of a way, where he is just completely other, um, there really is no good way to even make that question meaningful of does God know what I'm going to do next? Like
Mm-hmm.
that question implies time. You have the
Yeah.
word next there, right? So that question implies time. And this is actually the Boethius kind of came up with this whole idea, this whole distinction, and it really rocked the world of Christian philosophy and theology at the time. Um, like I said, I think Boethius was the 500s, 6th century. But So there's that way to look at it, right? And then I think when you add in the dimension of love and the emphasis upon the will there, it kind of starts to make a little bit more sense.
I think what people have difficulty with is people who choose to make other people suffer. The suffering put upon other people is where the question of free will makes it difficult for
Right,
other people
right,
to understand. Like, why would God let him do that or her do that to me or
right.
that
When
person?
when we
Yeah.
know clearly from history and from sacred scripture that God does intervene in certain people's sufferings and He does uh, relieve them, right? And this goes on to actually, I think this question isn't so much a question of free will as it is, and I've done a few videos on this, that I think this question is central to our evangelization of the world today, um, because I think it's the central question of the gospel. How do we understand suffering? That is the central question of the gospel, in my view. Um, and ultimately, the Catholic point of view would say that um, your suffering has infinite value because of God's suffering on the cross, Jesus' suffering on the cross. Because of, again, we're talking about how God is completely other. And so thinking that, first of all, that God became man, what the heck does that even mean? Um, it's really difficult to wrap your mind around. That's a reason why the first number of councils of the church, the first seven basically, really focused upon those questions of what does it mean for there to be a God man. And we're still wrestling with a lot of those questions today. But then, not only what does it mean for God to become man, but what does it mean for God to be so much man that He will suffer and die? Like, um, it's absolutely incredible. Um, if you have any concept of God that's not an anthropomorphized version of God, it's absolutely amazing what that entails. Um, and part of what it entails is that because God came and He suffered, the infinite was was broken down in a very real way. That's what suffering does, is it breaks us down, and because we're a whole entity, that breaking down is pain, and it's um, not only physical pain, but it's psychological pain, um, existential pain, and ah, it so the the infinite being broken down, it's like all of reality is being rifted at that moment on the cross, and because of what God is, and it's that suffering, that infinity kind of breaking down, um, that in a very real way turns the cross into an infinite event that is applicable throughout time, going in the past and the future, if you're looking at time linearly. Um, and so, therefore, we today, right here and now, are able to unite our sufferings with the infinite in His suffering. We, as finite creatures, are able to unite our finite sufferings with the infinite suffering of the infinite. Like, it's absolutely incredible. And so what that means for us right here and now is that our suffering has infinite value, and we can therefore, we cannot escape suffering. It's impossible. It's impossible. um think, for example, if you have too much pleasure, if you eat too much, what does it turn into? It turns into suffering. any pleasure, any pleasure will eventually turn into suffering if you have too much. And so it creates this crazy dichotomy that, like, if we have not enough pleasure, it's suffering. If we have too much pleasure, it's suffering. And that actual real pleasure in the middle, like, it's so rare. Um, like, for that actually to happen in our lives. And so most of it, it sounds like horrible to say, but it's the reality. Most of our lives are suffering. So how do we deal with that? And I think that Christianity offers, especially the modern world, an incredible answer to that question. Um, but the answer really only works if the person first assents to classical theism, I think. If you don't assent to that, it kind of doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Um, but if you assent to that, the theodicy, the story um, of God throughout salvation history is one of the most beautiful, really the most beautiful story that has ever existed, and has the most uh, applicableness to our lives, because of just the pervasiveness of suffering. So, yeah, sorry, Alexis, what was your original question so that I can
No,
bring it around?
no,
Was that answering
that
it?
was it.
Yeah, okay.
I just commented on the fact that people have a hard time when it comes to free will because of suffering. How
Yeah,
can
and I think it,
that also implies like that God doesn't love you because he there are many, many times that he just lets it
yeah,
happen. Where is he in that silence,
right, right.
But I think people forget as well when it comes to suffering, um, good comes out of it. Even with the deaths in the family, brings memories, good memories of that person. Um,
Yes, exactly, right,
uh, or the birth of a new baby. I would definitely go through it again just to
right.
have my children. You know,
Yeah,
those times that a husband and a wife at their last moments together, when one of them is about to go, is about to die, at that moment they're both suffering, brings back their whole lives in an instant.
uh,
And you can't have that without suffering. You don't realize, it's an essential part of what it means to be human, what it means to be truly happy, or to find true happiness. You need to suffer, just
right.
as like a piece of jewelry like gold or silver, you need to refine it with fire. It needs to go through some sort of cleansing and it's physical and it's painful and it hurts. But
Right.
through that, something new and beautiful and true comes about. So
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
no, that
And I
I
think that
think
that's,
we went on a tangent because of the whole thing. Yeah.
but that's an incredible point. And I did some videos on this question, about 6 months ago, and I have one on, like, why redemptive suffering um, is a natural thing, even, like, why an atheist can agree with redemptive suffering, and it's exactly for those reasons that you stated. Um, Another one would be, like, exercise. Exercise is a huge one that, like, people, you the pain brings a greater reality, right? And I think a lot of times when people ask the question, like, why do I suffer? Um why do the people around me suffer? Like, you have to first ask the question, what is suffering? Like, what is it exactly? Suffering in this fallen world that we live, even if maybe we couldn't suffer, we didn't feel pain, right? That's actually a greater suffering in this fallen world, because then we don't know when we've been hurt. We don't know, like, um there's a ton of horrible things that can happen if you can't feel pain, right? But even somebody who can't feel physical pain, they obviously can feel emotional pain, right? Um, and even on a natural level, there's good things that come from emotional pain, and I think that we don't acknowledge that a lot of the time, because what Christianity seeks to do is to look at the world as it is and propose the most beautiful solution to resolve all of these problems that we see, particularly the problem of suffering. And I think that's, you know, precisely why I say that this question of redemptive suffering is central to what the gospel is, particularly in our modern age. Um, but like it, it, we the question, why does suffering occur? Like, you can't escape it. What that question implies is that um, we're seeking heaven, really. We're seeking the new heavens and the new earth. We're seeking the eschaton, the end times. Um, we're wishing that uh, the original sin had never occurred and that we were still in the Garden of Eden, right? Um, there's like this innate knowledge in us, that we understand where we're going and what we're supposed to shoot for when we understand what's wrong with the world like that. And interestingly enough, Saint Bonaventure, um, who maybe I haven't really defined exactly who he is, but he was a Franciscan cardinal living in the 1200s. Just he met Saint Francis when he was a boy, so he was one of the first initial followers of Saint Francis. Um, and he was an amazing, amazing theologian. Probably my favorite theologian. Um, and he posits that the soul has three different faculties to it: the will, the intellect, and he also says that the soul has a thing called memory, a faculty called memory. Now, what that is not what we modern people think about memory. It's not like remembering the past. What it is remembering the stamp of God upon the world around us and upon ourselves. Um, and he thinks that that is just a natural part of what we are, right? People will, the kind of uh, saying that you're trying to fill the God-sized hole in your heart. Okay, it's been
Yeah.
used so much at this point. It sounds silly, but um, people for all of human history have noticed this, and the question of the meaning of suffering acknowledges that reality, that we are seeking um, perfection. We're seeking infinite perfection, which is exactly what we mean by God. Um, and we're seeking a world where that infinite perfection is able to act in an infinitely perfect way, and that there would be no resistance to that utopia, basically. And the problem is when we start to apply that utopia like to this fallen world. We try to be the bringers about of that utopia, right? This is precisely the problem, I think, with communism and like Marxist socialism, is that that's exactly what it's trying to do. It's trying to to impose upon an imperfect world perfection. It's trying to impose perfection upon an imperfect world, and it's not looking at reality. It's again, it's rooted in the mind. It's saying, I know that it should not be like this, so I will attempt to reconcile all the problems, right? And it's just not going to work. It doesn't work, um, and and you're living in uh, you're not living in reality at that point. So, again, circling back to realism, we we have to be rooted in reality. Reality is out there. It's not a product of the mind, and that comes back to the question of suffering as well. So,
Awesome. Well, all right. So one last question. We're done
yeah,
with the
yeah.
really heavy questions. For a beginner philosopher, what are
hmm
some suggestions that you have? What should we read? What should they listen to?
So I would really recommend the Institute of Catholic Culture's lectures on philosophy by Dr. John Cuddebeck. and he brings people through the primary sources of Plato and Aristotle, and you don't read the entire things during his course, but he gives you all of the really really important parts. Um, so I would recommend that as a course to kind of get your feet wet if that's something people would be interested in. But otherwise, I would really recommend Plato's Republic as an introductory philosophy work. It's not terribly long; it's like 300 pages. And Plato writes in a way, a lot of the good translators, or a lot of the translations out there, translate him in such a way that it's pretty accessible to really anybody. Um, like I don't think you have to be have a very technical understanding of philosophy to read Plato's Republic, or really any of Plato's works. They're pretty accessible. Um, so I would start there, because basically in any philosophy program, that's that's where you're going to start, and there's a reason for that because it's written in an easy way, but you also get you get really deep really quick. Um, so and then I think I would recommend this can take a bit more research, but I think after you went through John Cuddy Beck's class, I would recommend kind of dipping your feet into a bit of Aristotle, Aristotle's primary works. He starts with uh, the categories. Is kind of the first book that's usually put in his collected works, and the way that his collected works are arranged is in such a way where you can kind of read it through and it makes sense. They kind of builds upon each other. Um, and so I would honestly recommend that. You'll probably need to have a smartphone with you or a computer with you to look up certain words in a lot of the translations, because the way that they're translated. But I think it's kind of unavoidable. Um, it is a lot more technical. Aristotle's a lot more technical of a thinker than Plato is, um, and so you do need to learn a little bit of how he talks, and how he writes. Um, but I think once you understand his lingo, um, it's incredibly, incredibly helpful. I kind of, for those interested in the theological side of this too, I I equate Plato to somebody like Augustine or Bonaventure. They're much more accessible when you read them. It's much easier for you without any prior knowledge just to open up Augustine and read him, um, or open up Bonaventure, particularly his work, the Breviloquium. I've done a video on it if people want to look that up, but um, it's like his synthesis of his thought, for like a beginner, um, and it's pretty accessible, to read. Uh, so Plato's kind of like that, but Aristotle is like reading Thomas Aquinas. I think, if you sit down and you read Thomas Aquinas, it's a lot more
You gotta
difficult,
read it line by
to
line.
just jump in. Yeah, it's a lot more difficult to read him, um, and part of that is because Aquinas is rooted in Aristotle. So, a lot of the way Aquinas talks is the way Aristotle talks, and so you kind of need an introduction to Aristotle before you even read Aquinas. Whereas, like I was saying,
And I think it just
with
in
Augustine and yeah,
no, I was just gonna say, I think just in general, the nature of the subject requires you to have to sit down and, like I said, read it line by line because
it
the
does.
questions
Yeah, it
come
does.
as like a snowball. It will just work your intellect a lot. It will the
It
questions
will.
will be
It
asked and
will.
answered and go back again and then answered even more
Yes.
in depth. So that's how you no matter what, even if it's Plato or Aristotle or or St. Thomas Aquinas, you really got to take it one line at a time. And
Hmm.
um, yeah, you will get used to it. It's not something you just pick
Right.
up and then enjoy the first. Although that can happen. That can happen. That's
It can.
possible.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would also
Yeah, I
recommend
agree. Mm.
there's like some secondary source works out there that have been really, really good, that have been written in the last 50 years, particularly the work of Peter Kreeft. I think he does a really, really good
Yeah,
job
Peter
of
Kreeft is really
introducing
good.
Catholics to philosophy. So
Yeah,
he's
definitely.
definitely a go-to person. If
He put
if
together, like 100 or 200, philosophers, something like that, like an anthology. It's
Yes,
pretty
I haven't read
recent,
it yet, but
but
it
it's like
yeah,
an
and
introduction.
so it depends on kind of where you're at. If you want to try just jumping into Plato's Republic, I would encourage people to do that. That's To be honest, that's kind of what I did, and I thought it was pretty easy to read. Um, and then if you want to start getting into Aristotle, it's definitely a lot more difficult once you start wading into Aristotle. But I would recommend too. This is what I do. I listen to a lot of audiobooks, because I don't have a whole ton of time. Being a father, working full time, and all the other things in my life, to just sit down and read. I don't have a ton of time for that. And so like I will maximize like my commute to work by listening to an audiobook. I listened to most of Aristotle's works, and Plato's Republic. I had read Plato's Republic previously, um, but I really think that if you're an auditory learner, and even if you don't think you're an auditory learner, I would give audiobooks a try, especially if you're struggling to find the time to read, um, because at least you're getting something then. You know um, you're you're filling your mind with something really, really good. Like, do you listen, if you have a 30-minute commute to work, do you listen to music the whole time, or like talk radio where it might just make you angry? um, or like are you filling yourself with the wisdom of our forefathers? Not to say
Mhm.
that you can't listen to music or listen to talk radio, but like, um, that if you're really interested in these types of works, and you're struggling to find the time to read them, I would 100% recommend audiobooks. And there are a ton of resources, especially for Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas. Um, there are uh, mountains of audiobooks out there that are well narrated. You just do a Google search and you'll find a ton of them. LibriVox is a really, really good uh, resource for stuff like that. They have really well narrated audiobooks. So I would recommend LibriVox. So yeah.
And you mentioned
She's
you have
tired.
videos on your YouTube channel.
Yeah, I have so I have tons and tons of playlists on my YouTube channel of stuff that I've done. I categorize all my videos into a bunch of different playlists, and so I have I think my largest playlist is on philosophy. It has like 80 videos in
Awesome.
it. So if
Awesome.
you want to go through and just go through that as an introduction to, by all means, feel free to take that up as a resource. Um, I think I'm,
It's a podcast
I think
too,
I'm,
so they could probably listen to it
yes,
in their cars
yeah,
on the way.
exactly.
There
So
you
I mean
go,
it,
guys.
yep, yep, exactly. So it's called Catholicism in the car for a reason, because a I love listening to stuff in the car, and I record stuff in the car too, um, and it works out kind of well. Um, so yeah, feel free to check it out, Catholicism in the Car. I also have a website, www.catholicisminthecar.com. You can find basically anything that I'm involved in. Also, like I, I'm doing more like interviews like this and some speaking events too. So if people are interested in finding out like where I'll be, there's an upcoming events page on my website and things like that. Anything that I do, that's recorded, I try to get that recording and post it on my website, or like videos I do on other people's channels. I have a playlist, for that as well, where I link those videos. So you can pretty much find anything I'm involved in if you just go to catholicisminthecar.com. You can find the podcast on any podcast platform, and then also YouTube. So
Awesome.
um, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for joining me, Parker.
Yeah. Oh my
This was an
goodness.
awesome discussion. I love
It's
it.
always a joy. Oh my goodness. I hope
Uh,
people I hope I was able to convey things in a way that makes sense.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it's kind of a fire hose sometimes. These questions being so deep,
I know. I know. They
it's
just take so much. And we could have just done one question for like the whole hour and a
oh yeah, we
half
could easily. So
easily. So,
yeah, I would
so
encourage people, ask these questions of yourselves and think about
yeah,
them. Don't be afraid to be an armchair philosopher. It's pretty fun. So
yeah. Right.
and I want to say too, like I don't have any official credentials in this stuff.
Yeah, me neither.
I'm just like
But it's just
I just
so
love it. I'm an
interesting.
enthusiast, so it is. It's
Uh,
so, and I think
yeah.
you don't have to have credentials to be a philosopher. Um, Plato didn't have credentials.
No, a
Aristotle
lot
didn't
of
have credentials. Most of everybody who was a philosopher throughout history until the
yeah.
1700s didn't have credentials. So
And now a lot of the people that do have credentials aren't that good. So
yeah, exactly. So um,
right.
yes, exactly. So all right.
All right.
Well, I guess
Thank
we'll
you so
wrap
much for
up.
joining
But
me. Right.
yeah, thanks,
See you.
Alexis.
Bye.
See ya.